Okay, so we're talking about the multiple levels of complexity that we see in living things. Let's start at the bottom and work our way back up. Subatomic particles. Sub means below. So this is below the level of an atom, smaller than an atom. Protons, neutrons, and electrons combine together to form atoms. Atoms are things like hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and those bond together and interact with one another to form more complex structures called molecules. So, for example, two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom can bond together to form a molecule of water, or one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms combine to form one molecule of carbon dioxide. Molecules can combine and form even more complex structures called macromolecules, big molecules, to put it simply. And these are the really complex molecules that make up cells. Macromolecules are things that you've heard of before: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids like DNA. And these are the complex macromolecules that make up our cells. They also make up the food that we eat. Everything you eat is made up of macromolecules, and your cells are composed of macromolecules. So the old saying, your mom has probably said this to you before, that you are what you eat. In a chemical sense, that's very true. Now, notice I put cells in all caps. I did that for a reason, because if we're starting at the bottom and working our way up, the cell level is the first level that we would consider to be alive. Macromolecules are not living. Proteins are not alive. DNA is not a living thing. It's part of a living thing, but it's not alive. But cells are. And as we've discussed earlier, some organisms, like bacteria, are just a single cell. You, as a multicellular organism, have many cells, and those cells form tissues: muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, nervous tissue. And those various tissues combine to form organs: heart, lungs, liver, stomach. Those organs are combined and work together with other organs to form what we call organ systems. And you have a bunch of those: respiratory system, circulatory system, nervous system, and many more. And all of those systems combined form you, a very highly complex, multicellular organism. All right, so these two images here are I placed them here to introduce the next characteristic of living organisms. So let's look at the rabbit here. This is called a snowshoe hare. And snowshoe hares have a very particular characteristic, and that is if you see a snowshoe hare in the summertime, it has kind of a reddish-brown fur. Now, we don't have snowshoe hares here in North Carolina. You find them in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado, up into Canada. In the summertime, they have brownish fur, reddish-brown fur. But when it starts to snow in the wintertime, they slowly transition from that reddish-brown fur to a solid white coat for obvious reasons. It allows them to blend in with the snow cover and avoid being spotted by predators. Makes them less likely to be eaten by a predator. Now, this particular characteristic would not work well for the rabbits here in Moore County, North Carolina, because if they turned white in the winter, since we don't get a whole lot of snow around here, being white in the winter would not be advantageous. It would, in fact, make them more likely to be spotted by a predator. So we call this kind of trait an adaptation. It's a specific characteristic that improves the chances for survival, and it's also a characteristic that can be passed down from parents to offspring. In the other image here, you see obviously a cactus, And you may not know this, that the spines of a cactus are actually leaves. They're modified leaves. And having spines rather than traditional leaves is an adaptation that has evolved in cacti over many millions of years. And it probably serves two important functions. Having these small, skinny leaves reduces evaporative water loss in the desert. That's important. It also forms a nice protective barrier that prevents animals from taking a big bite out of the cactus. So that leads me to the next characteristic of living organisms, and that is that they have the ability to adapt. Species can change over time, over many, 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 many generations, to become better able to survive and reproduce in their local environment. And when this happens, when these changes evolve over time, we call these things adaptations. So the ability of the snowshoe hare to turn white in winter, or the fact that cacti have spines rather than traditional plant leaves, those are adaptations. The next characteristic that living organisms share in common is the ability to maintain homeostasis. That's a very important word in biology. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a stable internal environment so that even when the conditions around the organism are changing, conditions inside the organism can be maintained at a stable level. And that's absolutely essential for life. And there's a lot of good examples of this. I tried to pick some examples, at least the first two that we can really kind of identify with. So especially the first one. So we've all been outside on a cold winter day playing in the snow or something. And especially if we're not dressed right for it, our body temperature begins to drop below the normal 98.6. And our body, as endothermic, warm-blooded mammals, we have mechanisms in place to bring that body temperature back up. We start to shiver. And the blood vessels in our skin and our fingers and our nose, those blood vessels constrict to reduce blood flow to those areas, and that holds in the heat. On the other hand, if you are exercising in the summer, going out for a jog or football practice or something on a hot July day, and our body heat becomes too high, we have mechanisms to bring it back down. We sweat, and we get evaporative heat loss through sweating. Or the blood vessels in our skin, our nose, and our face dilate, increasing blood flow to those areas, which allows heat to escape our body. So those are examples of maintaining a stable body temperature despite what's going on in the environment around us. That's a great example of homeostasis. I'm going to skip to example 3 here because it's going to take me a while to talk about blood sugar. But a simple example of how even a single-celled organism can maintain homeostasis would be a single-celled unicellular bacteria using its membrane to regulate the amount of water going in or out of the cell so that it can maintain the proper water balance in order to survive in its environment. And we'll talk a lot more later about how cells use their membrane to control and regulate what goes in and what goes out of the cell. So in fact, we'll do a whole unit on that later on.